without further ado, and I've got it on this slide too, without further ado, I want to bring up our moderator, Joe Conway, who's the CEO of Stable Kernel. Help me welcome Joe. Take it away, Joe.
Can y'all hear me? Awesome. Good. I'm also going to bring up the panel right now, and they can introduce themselves. And I'm not playing a game. This is where the questions are, I promise. Full attention. All right, we can start right here. Just head on down the line. Ding it. Yeah, go. I love it. I think it's coming on. Hello? Yeah, we're good.
All right. Hi, I'm Derek Harp. I am a serial entrepreneur. I started a cybersecurity company when I was leaving the Navy in the mid-'90s, and I've been starting companies since then, largely in cybersecurity. Privacy is not my main area, but I think cybersecurity and privacy are getting increasingly overlapped, and there's a lot of issues related to how we secure the information that that people want to keep control of. So I'm real excited to be here and participate in the panel with some great colleagues.
Good evening. My name is Matt Garland. I'm the VP of Research at Pindrop. We're not quite a startup anymore, I guess, but we grew up here in Atlanta, and we protect voice interactions. So if you call your bank, odds are that we are protecting your account. 8 of the top 10 banks are our customers. We look at the voice part of that, the audio part of that call, to prevent social engineering attacks, to prevent fraudsters from calling up and extracting information about your account and then using that against you. We do that not only for contact center calls today, but also for voice-enabled devices, which are becoming an enormous category in the future. And so excited to talk about identity and privacy with you guys tonight.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, awesome. Hi everyone, my name is Meera Thambireddy. I am an information security engineer at LinkedIn. I work with different product teams at LinkedIn. I've been doing that for about 2 years. Now I provide design and security guidelines, and including privacy guidelines with them. So I'm involved in the entire engineering process, right from design reviews to execution and implementation of the security requirements that we provide with privacy in mind.
Hey, I'm Mike Gonzalez, and I am with High Tech Partners. I work as a fractional or virtual CTO, CIO. I was most recently at Oglethorpe University as the CIO there. So 4 years, I got a good understanding of what students want and what privacy was all about from their perspective. I've also worked at Microsoft, Oracle, and a number of other companies in the tech field. I've been doing it for 35 years. Didn't have the problems with privacy then that we do today, but it's a fascinating topic.
Share this very small mic, so I'm looking forward to that. Good evening, my name is Eric Daycake. I'm a director in the Chief Privacy Office at AT&T here in Atlanta. One of the few remaining here in Atlanta, but proud Atlantan. Appreciate you having me. I've been with the company about 15 years or so. Started out in another bad word, audit services. Spent some time in audit and then over into compliance and slowly made my way into the privacy field about 3 or so years ago. I primarily support our IoT business unit, so mostly Internet of Things. Do a lot of work with our connected vehicles and our smart cities. You all may know Michael Zito and others who have been in this forum and have been sponsors for years, so I'm very happy to be here. And then recently I dubious distinction 2.5 years ago of being charged with our GDPR compliance across our enterprise business. So I think I've already seen a number of GDPR questions in the queue, so I may unfortunately be on the hot seat there, but really happy to be here. I noticed that Joe and Matt have grown beards. I look exactly the same as my picture, so hopefully there's no confusion.
Awesome. All right. I think we got some great questions to start. So clearly, we have products and services that have and collect a lot of information, and we need to make money off of that information. Oh, you want me to talk louder? Okay. We need to make money off of that information, but there's a fine line between that and overstepping privacy. Meera, what do you think about that?
So the problem here arises when we are focusing too much on monetization of services at the cost of user privacy. So we need to know exactly the data that we are collecting about the users and also have the business monetization rules in place. So according to me, I think there has to be 3 C's that we need to follow. The first one is clarity, the second one being consistency, and the third one being control. So when I say clarity, we need to mention the data that we are using about users, clearly what is the purpose that we are using that for, and the members or users should know what exactly that data is being used for. That's the clarity where it comes from. And consistency is essentially the clarification that we have provided to users. We need to make sure we are consistent with the promise we made to them. The third one is the control that we can give to users about their data. So one of the things that we can do is providing fine-grained controls that we can. So if there is a piece of information that we are using about the users, then what are we doing exactly? What are we doing about that? And can we give them an option to opt in or opt out? I think if we consider all of those things about user privacy, we can strike a fair balance between monetizing services for using the data that users provide.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think that there's a number of things there I'd love to talk about, but consistency I think is big, and I'll talk more in an enterprise space because a lot of the work I do or have done with some of our data patterns teams have been more at an aggregate level. So that makes my ears perk up, and it's a lot easier to tell the business, hey, we can make this happen because it's aggregate, right? So, but the consistency comes into play, and we really put the business in a position where they feel like they can move quickly. So we've set some consistent, we call them guardrails. You probably have similar approaches. And so we shift some of the accountability from the privacy office back into the business. They feel empowered. We've got a set of criteria or guardrails that they'll abide by. And then we engage our legal partners to sort of keep track of that. So I like, certainly choice is fantastic, but I do like the consistency because even for if you're supporting your clients, when they know they're going to get a consistent type review or they know the consistent controls, it just eases that tension between a privacy group and a business unit. They feel empowered, you get your job done, everyone smiles, everyone wins.
I think that's how we earn trust from users too, and businesses as well.
Yeah, so even as an end user myself, I get the deal that I'm giving you something about myself for a service in return, as long as there's clarity, as you stated, and consistency in what's taken from me, right, to help monetize the product so that we can all enjoy it. That's good. I think we can run into problems when no one here on the panel, of course, but when certain providers maybe are doing things they're not even aware they're doing with our data to third parties, fourth parties, extracts of data that end up out there somewhere on the web.
You said something about aggregate I found really interesting. Would you expand on what that means in this context?
Yeah, so in this, and there's, there are more textbook definitions. We get into, now you have pseudonymization. People love talking about that. Anonymization, aggregate, de-identified. I could go on and on. In this specific example I was talking about, and I can only speak for AT&T, of course, as you consume our products and services, we're obviously fully disclosed, transparent, letting you know that we're collecting your information. And there are businesses out there that might like to have some of the insights from that information. But instead of saying, oh, hey, this is Eric Daycake and this is what he does, we take Eric Daycake, we take Joe, we take everybody else and we aggregate that up. So there's no ability for anyone to identify who that data belongs to, and we're still able to give a level of insights for our clients, the people we're selling those aggregate insights to. And so we still afford our clients and our consumers the ability to opt out. So if you say, I don't know if I trust your aggregate process, go ahead and don't include me in any of that. They have that clear choice through their preferences. So, but that's the concept. We take everybody, we would aggregate that information up. If you're okay with that, we may make that available to third parties in a for sale situation. But it's always at the aggregate level with no ability to re-identify.
So this term that I've been hearing an awful lot of, privacy by design, what does that mean?
It sounds like Mira and I are going to talk about this a good bit. But I think there's a way to bring the others in, because I really think this security by design was probably the first use of the term. So I think the privacy world is sort of borrowed from that. Again, you hear privacy by design. If you know GDPR, you hear data protection by design. And I think the newest one is privacy first, which happens to be our tagline. I don't know how that happened, but this concept is, I think it's pretty basic. It's common sense. The closer to the ideation and development lifecycle, whether it's a piece of software, whether it's a product, the closer you can get engineers, architects, heck, even sales folks thinking about privacy first, the better off you're going to be. And so, what does that mean? So, privacy by design could be something as simple as asking one question to a product team: do you really need that much data? And product folks are in here, and by the way, I want to get as much data as we possibly can, as long as it's responsibly used and it's disclosed and we understand that it's a primary use and not a secondary use. So at the most basic level, it's embedding these ideas of, if I am a user, to your point, am I going to scratch my head about what you're doing with my data? Am I going to think of, kind of give you one of these, like, really? You did that? And so the closer you can get that up to the development cycle, the better off you'll be. Now, you can get advanced, and depending on the size of your organization, this is a challenge. This is a huge challenge for AT&T. I wish I could tell you we have one software development lifecycle or one product development lifecycle. I spend every day trying to find out where folks are thinking stuff up and trying to create products. So I would argue you have a harder time identifying your channels than you do talking very basics about what data do you want to collect? Why do you need that data? Is there another way for you to achieve your business purpose with less data? And if you really need that data, does it need to be in the clear? So, and that's where we kind of have this interesting dance with our security brethren. So I think you guys, this might be a good chance for you to jump in.
I'll give a sort of a concrete example of that, right? You look at rules or guardrails, as you said, like, don't collect data you don't need. And when you do need data, can you use a proxy for the value that you care about? So one example from our space is that it's very interesting to look at the series of interactions and the behavior around a particular bank account. Because if somebody is trying to attack a bank account, they're going to be coming through the online channel, they're going to be coming through the phone, they're going to be coming through mobile devices and all of these things. And those are all correlated in the bank's systems by the account record. And so from our point of view on the phone channel, we want to understand when phone calls are coming in that are related to the same account, because they might be coming from lots of different phone numbers. They might be coming from different people. My wife and I share a bank account. And so we want to build that correlation. So in order to do that, we have to know that all of these transactions are occurring regarding the same account. One way that we could do that is by having the bank give us the account number, and we could begin correlating. But you probably don't want me to have your bank account number, right? Nor do the banks want me to have your bank account number. So, and frankly, we don't want it either. So privacy by design, or security by design in this case, means we don't actually get your bank account number. We get what's called a tokenized version or a hashed version of your bank account number. It's one-to-one with your bank account number, but it's not your bank account number. So I can't ever get that account number and use it against you. Nobody can use that against you. And yet we still get the benefit that we wanted. We understand the correlation between all of those transactions. Make sense?
I think the analogy is between the security development lifecycle and privacy by design is a really good one. And that is more an area where I've had some exposure over the years. Bolting on security and hence bolting on privacy after the fact is tough. Doing it from the foundational element, and there's still lots of people writing code, probably also designing systems and not looking at the data without a secure process. So they're writing it. The engineers are, in love with building the product, and they're not really, mature enough and have a discipline to say, how do we go about doing this? When do we inspect our own code for its own vulnerability? So that process of committing up front is an expense. And I think the challenge at the big company level is there's a willingness or even a mandate and desire to do this, and they got to look at the plethora of projects. The problem in the middle market, where I do a lot more of my advice work, is not necessarily allocating the capital to do it. It's an expense to be disciplined around a secure process. And so I'm assuming privacy is going to be the same kind of commitment, financial commitment, whether that's internal costs, your own team costs, that's a real cost, and then sometimes having experts come in that have a particular expertise that you don't have. So I think people do need to commit to that. I'm an advocate for it. Even my smallest startups, we bring in someone to look at least annually at our code. And I think it makes sense that we'll have to start looking also what kind of information do we have and what are we doing with it with the same lens.
Yeah, I just use the pay me now or pay me later. I mean, that generally works. It's like, you can pay us now to fix this, or you can wait till you're trying to launch next Tuesday. And we find out that, no, we've got to step back, and whether it's a security or a privacy control that has to go back in, tell me how much that's going to cost, right? And
It always costs more later too, doesn't it?
always, always. Now, I don't know if finding the sweet spot is the challenge for you all in your individual businesses, because for me, I don't want to get engaged when someone, in the back of the room here draws something on a napkin, because that's going to change, and how do you keep track of that, right? But I don't want to wait till it's already about to be released in production. So I find the biggest challenge in the privacy by design space, people have common sense for the most part. It's getting them at the right point in time, and that just takes understanding your clients, understanding your internal processes, and I would love to have the problem of some of our friends in the auto manufacturing business. Nothing goes in a car without an engineer, right? So I don't have that luxury, but that's another really good example. And now you might have something similar. I mean, you can't get something into the interface without going through a certain process.
You mentioned something interesting about security, right? So it really makes sense to protect your data, but people that are attacking, people are trying to get into the information that you guys as companies have. Why? I mean, what are they doing with that information?
The exploit opportunities for information now are just manifold. We're entering a period of cybersecurity as an industry. Is kind of, if you look for some sort of index, was $1 billion in 1997 when I started my first company. That was the total spend on information security, as it was then called. And today it's somewhere between, like us last year, between 80 and $90 billion, and they're forecast for it to be in the hundreds, mid-hundreds, 100 billion, 140 billion to 180 billion in really just 5 more years. So if you look at that, what's propelling this, and that there is all kinds of what I would call malicious use case for all of this content, information, data, intellectual property. It's lots of different things, and we're adopting more connectivity every minute. And so I think my personal belief is we've had a free ride. We've grabbed all this efficiency and celebrated the heck out of it. I can do more things with less people. I got all this automation. And the truth is there was a hidden cost that we didn't pay, and now we have to pay it. So people can gripe about investing in privacy or cybersecurity, but I think it's just you've got that like balloon payment at the end. We didn't pay it along the way, and now we have to pay that.
I'll tell a story about how attackers use the information. So one of the interesting things about working in voice and analyzing these calls is we actually get to hear the attack. So and it's really interesting when we present to our customers' executives and play them back recordings of these attacks. It's very visceral reaction. So we in one of our early deployments, we got an alert on a call. I was at the customer tuning the system, and so pulled that call up and began listening to it to understand what we had alerted on. And I hear the rep say, "Thank you for calling big financial institution. Who am I speaking with today?" And the voice on the other end says, "This is Tony Soprano," not his real name, very Italian name, except the voice was sort of a West African accent. So radar went up. Mr. Soprano, I need to ask you a few questions to verify your identity. Can you tell me the last 4 of your social? Last four of social are given. Can you tell me your date of birth? Date of birth is given. Okay, I'm going to need to ask you some more questions. And they switch to the really hard questions that if you've ever called your bank and they think you're a fraudster, they go to your credit report and they pull questions like, which of the following makes of car have you ever owned? Your monthly mortgage payment is somewhere between these two numbers or these two numbers or these two numbers. The questions that you as a genuine customer are probably not going to get right because you can't remember that, right? But the fraudster, in this case, got every single one of those right because he had data from some compromise and he's looking at the answers. And so they get to the end of those questions and the rep asks, Mr. Soprano, how can I help you today? What's the balance in my account? 90-something thousand dollars. I'd like to wire $89,000 to Cambodia. That's what fraudsters are doing with your data. So if you're concerned about, why does data privacy matter? Why do we care about this? That's what's happening behind the scenes. Now, the beautiful thing about that is that we caught that, right? We alerted on that call, and Mr. Soprano, wherever he was, at his kid's soccer game or, out on his boat or whatever, had no clue that somebody was reaching in and trying to wire $89,000 of his kid's college fund or his retirement to Cambodia. And we were able to stop that. But that's a very real risk, and that happens, one in about every 2,000 calls into an enterprise contact center. So it's a big problem.
Sorry, my Face ID takes a second. If you got more, Mike.
Yeah, I just became aware of a really interesting use of content. It was a hack into the email system, but also into the voicemail system. And they were able to create a voicemail from the CEO, from picking words from voicemails of his real voice, and then leave that for the right person to do a wire transfer, a big one. And I'm going to be in a meeting and not be able to do this. You need to do it now. And it's the actual voice of the actual person.
That happened to us the other day. Richard was like, you don't type like this, do you? You also never asked me for a sandwich before.
There's a number of people who will go out and hack your phone system by calling your business, and then what do you usually use as your extension or your code to get into your voicemail? 1, 2, 3, 4, or your extension, whatever that is. And usually at the beginning, there's somewhere it'll say, oh, you hit pound and ask for a particular person. It'll actually get you to that person. There's a whole scam thing around that. But I think really what we're talking about here is personally identifiable information. What makes me who I am? What's secret to me that you don't know? My mother's maiden name, I used to think was secret, but I don't believe that anymore, because when she passed away recently, people get on and they go, oh yeah, and next thing you know, you're people putting up diagrams of the family tree and things like that. So I think what these people are doing is they're taking a bunch of different information, putting it in aggregate about you, but not in a anonymous way. They're pulling together these little pieces of your life. They're taking videos off of Facebook, or I don't want to call out any particular service or whatever, but they're pulling little bits from you. And this is why no one should ever just friend people because they ask to be friended. Because they're going to pull all these different little pieces, put together voicemails, and ask people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. But hey, it's the president of the company. It sounds just like him.
So turning the page a little bit, I have to talk into this because it's not working well. I'm going to do this. Changing the channel a little bit. Europe and Europe 2, California, have passed a lot of laws recently. Someone like that, good. And that has changed a number of things, especially related to the way that we handle data. How has that changed?
Oh, Lord. Well,
You knew it was coming.
I'll start. Yeah, I planted that question. GDPR, of course, pretty strict data protection and privacy regime, and I say data protection because that's what's in the title, and so a lot of folks think, oh, it's just privacy, but it truly does cross the boundaries, and so we're fortunate to have really great partners. But I guess what I would say about GDPR is, for organizations who hadn't thought about privacy, period, it was probably not a welcome, but a nice wake-up call, because obviously Europe is businesses today tend to be global. Footprint is, if it's in one place, it's in every place, particularly those of you with e-commerce sites and others. I'll tell you, we were somewhat fortunate at AT&T, because as I was mentioning earlier, while we are a number 5 or 7 global brand from a recognition standpoint, we don't have any direct relationship with consumers in the European Union. We don't sell wireless service to consumers. We don't sell connected vehicles. We deal in heavy machinery. We deal in enterprise business. So for us, it was what I would say in the privacy organization, what I took away from GDPR was it was a really great opportunity for us to take stock of what do we truly have from a data standpoint? Because I think that's, I don't want to say the first time, but I will tell you it's the first time we really sat down and said, if someone asked me today, show me every personal data element that you have that runs through your systems, what would I do? So from a data inventory standpoint alone, I think it was a really great exercise. Again, I don't think most people would admit to that, but it was really helpful for us. Now, the beauty of that is, all of a sudden, mini EU comes along, and when we get California, which is still a lot of variables up in the air, is you're almost ahead of the game. So that inventory work, all the sweat and tears that you guys or your teams put into GDPR, not only is that a competitive advantage in the marketplace, and I've got plenty of stories where we've won business in Europe simply by showing them our GDPR program. So it is clearly a differentiator, and it's a competitive advantage. And now with California, we'll hopefully be able to use a lot of that work we've already done. But it opens up a whole new consumer world for us. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's been fantastic. I've kept my job for 2.5 years thanks to the regulators in the European Union. California seems to be extending my contract out a little bit. But I think on the whole, there's a lot of hand-wringing and there's a lot of stuff in there that may be excessive. But I will tell you, for us, it was a way for us to go to our business and say it's time to really pull back the curtain a little bit, and understand truly what we're doing there. So it was for me, nice experience. Happy to say we've been 3 or so months into the GDPR experiment, and it's paying dividends already. We've won a number of business engagements because of that, and our marketing teams are on board. They're out there with collateral. So I would argue if you've lived through it and you had to suffer through it, make sure you're using that as a competitive advantage. That would be my advice.
Anybody else feel real strongly about GDPR? I know, Mira, you probably had a few things to do.
Yeah, I think GDPR is a really good thing. I think that in organizations that have a lot of data about a lot of different people, you kind of tend to forget, you look at it as a commodity, right? Like water from the tap. It's hot or it's cold, but it's coming out. But the fact is, there's a lot of information in there that people can use to hack your bank account or use in some way, shape, or form to sway your opinions by presenting you with certain types of advertising over others. So in a lot of ways, I think it's a kind of about time that we sort of step back, wake up call. How are we categorizing all this data? What are we doing with it? Yeah, it's safe from what we can see, but how much do we have on Mr. X, right? And where is it? And how many extracts exist of that data in a spreadsheet somewhere that's maybe been transferred to somebody else or somewhere else? For me, I think it's a positive thing. And we're heading in the right direction. It's not perfect by any means, but we have to get control. And as a consumer, I think you should have the right to be forgotten. And that, whatever I leave behind digitally shouldn't have to be left behind.
I think from an internal perspective, I agree with you guys about classifying the data, identifying all the data aspects that we have or about users and also classifying them. But apart from that, we should also have fine-grained controls as to which teams or which person has access to a certain set of data. For example, if there is one team that is implementing a certain feature, are we giving them just enough data to implement that feature, or are we giving them all the data about the user, right? So that's something that we need to keep that in mind as well. And for example, I think we talked about aggregation here. So do we really need to know Joe's identity or Derek's identity here to be able to pull up those statistics, right? So I think that's when anonymization comes into picture. So I think those are some of the things that we need to think about from an internal perspective and for regulations.
One last point that I would just put on this, because again, this is Eric Daycake speaking, not Eric Daycake from AT&T. One revelation for me is it's one thing to understand the data elements you have, and generally there is a defined purpose for that data element. And even though you think you're only using it for that purpose, and it may be very legitimate, and you may have another legitimate purpose that you're using it for, but just getting down at that level of the data element and identifying every business process that uses that data element, that was another really great exercise, even for our business. And I'm not going to tell you, because there's people in here in the data world that'll laugh at me, I'm not going to tell you that people said, oh, I don't need this, let's get rid of it, right? But at least I know that you've got it, and we've got a defined business purpose, and I could stand behind it if a consumer came forward or if a regulator came forward. So again, it gets back to consistency, transparency, and really being able to stand up in front of somebody with a straight face and say, no, I know why I have that data, versus, oh crap, I didn't know I had that data, right? So it was a nice exercise.
We talk about for the consumer, protecting them, great, right? And it seems like the onus is on you guys here to do the work to protect their information, and that's, I guess you said it was good overall, right? But there's some negative. It's work, it's effort, it keeps you employed, fantastic. But is there anything bad that happens to the consumer for this? Is there like a double-edged sword in some maybe the more onerous parts of the GDPR, the California regulations?
I'll take a stab at that. So one of the things that we look at because of our security focus is how are attackers going to try to subvert what exists and what is in place. And you sort of saw that in the story that I told, right? That the attacker is coming in and taking advantage of information that they know, but they also take advantage of processes. So, for example, we've seen attackers who are attacking institutions that use voice biometrics to protect the account. So you've enrolled your voice, and you have to say some phrase in the IVR to get into your bank account. And what the fraudster will do in that situation is they will clearly not have your voice, and they will fail the voice authentication. But that also happens enough to legitimate users that the fraudster, when they get to an agent, will say, yeah, I couldn't get through the voice thing, I need to re-enroll my voice. And that happens often enough that the agent says, okay, well, we'll put you through the re-enrollment process. What's your mother's maiden name? What are we doing? We're falling back to the same knowledge-based authentication that we know is broken in order to protect that process. So that's the kind of mindset that the attacker has. One of the things that I'll be very interested to see as GDPR rolls out, and as we see users take advantage of the right to be forgotten and the right to object to processing, is whether attackers will also take advantage of those rights and will say, I want you to forget all of the behavioral data that you have on me and re-baseline using the attacker's behavioral data. And so I'm a little curious to see how that develops.
Yeah, I had not thought about that, but that is fantastic. That's something. But you did say something about authentication that I think rings true with us, because I think again, we don't have consumer customers in Europe. So the good news about that is if I were a consumer and calling in or saying, or even if there's an online form that says, hey, I want you to forget all this information. Or by the way, we talk about deletion, right to be forgotten. Let's talk about rectification, right? I want you to, you don't have the right email address for me, right? This is really my email address, and then all of a sudden I get a PIN that I can then reset something. So I know this is a challenge that most companies will face in California. This applies to California consumers. What does that mean? How do I validate that you have a right as are you a Californian consumer? And so I don't envy our enterprise customers who have to validate these folks who are entering these requests. I haven't asked the question, but now I'm going to. But we'll certainly see something very similar in California. The idea that they could, erase some behaviors to re-baseline, which would then justify why all of a sudden you're connecting from certain IP addresses that you never connected from before. Right? I mean, that's what I went immediately to IP address. And we use that a lot for fraud detection. Oh, you always connect from this IP address. Well, I told you to forget that, because by the way, that's personal data. And then I re-baseline from a new set of IP. So it's a really interesting thing. But authentication will always be a challenge for that.
Yeah, that whole thing falls under unintended consequences, and there are potentially a bunch. I had a really fortunate opportunity to be in Germany and in Belgium before all this launched, with politicians at the Bundestag who were responsible for parts of this, and at the EU. And then we spent a week here with the same people. We came here and we got with some U.S. legislators really to exchange information, and they were asking questions about GDPR. And it's interesting, the origin of this. The notion, not to throw anybody under the bus, but the notion that a super smart group of people got together and put this set of rules together, and they comprehensively thought of everything, and were true experts in all the requisite areas, is just not how it came about. And so there, the big concern will be unintended consequences. There were professional politicians involved heavily in the process. There's interesting, if you say, why did this come from where it came from versus why didn't it maybe start here? And I didn't really think about this, but is a cultural bias towards government and my information. And as I spent time with those colleagues, especially in Germany, if you go back to mid-century, last century, there's a real concern with what government does and can do. And so it's culturally there, and they think it's very funny how their perception of most Americans is, whatever, you can have all this information. And there's probably some truth to that.
Well, that's actually an interesting question, is do you think the average user has any clue what they're giving up?
No.
That's a pretty straightforward. No. Does anyone out there think that they use? Yeah, no, I didn't think so.
And if they have an idea what they gave up because of things they entered, what happens to it, the answer is definitely no.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and this isn't on the question list, so I apologize. But what happens when all of these companies with all of these data, companies don't last forever? What happens when that information gets dissolved and purchased by the highest bidder? What happens when Facebook goes down?
I mean, if you look at the terms, right? The terms and conditions. Not that any of us actually ever read those, right? But if you read them, a lot of them have transferability clauses in them. And yes, they get sold to the highest bidder, right? So whoever acquires the assets of that company acquires the data, unless there's something in there that says otherwise, right? And I think when you start talking about, Mira was talking about consistency, and the consistency that I expect as a consumer, I signed up for your service under some auspices, right? That you were going to provide me the ability to network with other people, and I didn't sign up to for certain other things. And if that data starts getting used for that, then that's an inconsistency and I think that's what Mira was getting at. But transferability might lead to inconsistency. I signed up, I gave you my data under these assumptions that are no longer hold. And so I think that's a very important thing. And I don't know really whether anybody is addressing that, right? Whether people are building their businesses in a way that says this data that we're collecting can only be used under these conditions, and those conditions go along with the assets when they transfer.
Probably shrinks the value of that company a bit.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's a force against that in terms of, you know, everybody has an asset that they want to maximize the value of, and I mean, there's a risk.
It's like when you buy a house go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was just going to say, before coming on the panel today, I had to go back, and I've done this before, and I've talked to high school classes about this. You know, pull up iTunes and look at the terms, and now everybody has a privacy statement. Google, 27 pages, and it's actually more readable than most. Facebook's was also huge and kind of hard to navigate and print out. You had to actually scrape the screen in some cases to get the information. But it's the changes. So I signed up for this thing 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and along the way it's been like, hey, we've updated our stuff, is that okay? You know, you can look at it here. Who wants to sit and read 27 pages? You know, for all the different providers that you use. Because it's not just, you know, social networking. It's the bank, it's the newspaper, it's the, you know, how many passwords do you have? How many accounts do you have? 200? 150? I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah, this is an ongoing issue for those of you in the IoT space, because we always get the argument, okay, great, I can write a great policy, but how can I show a privacy policy on a 3.2-inch square watch face? Or when I get into a vehicle, and even if I have a Tesla, which I don't, I mean, you know, 13-inch, am I going to scroll down and read that? You know, and so I think some of our biggest challenges in the IoT space, for those of you in that area, gets to notice, disclosure, providing consent. And so, you know, then you default back to an app. Well, now you've introduced another variable and another endpoint, right? So now we got security questions. So notice and disclosure, to me, it will always be a challenge. I tend to agree with you. Or I shouldn't say this out loud, but, you know, Google does a decent job, nice job. I spend a lot of my day helping clients fit clear, no questions asked, disclosures and consent into mobile apps. That's what a lot of us do. Luckily, I have really good attorneys, but you know, it's like, well, can we just carve 6 characters out? You know, can we just drop this out, or can it be an interstitial and they just link out? And the answer is always no. You know, if they've got to scroll, they got to scroll. Email, text is another way to send it to them. So consent, disclosure, notice, all challenges.
Yeah, there's an interesting question from the crowd here that sort of addresses that, which is what are companies doing to educate and engage their customers on, oh, it just moved on me, in protecting their own privacy, and is every solution technology-based?
I'll just tell you that we've had a number of initiatives over the year, but I mean, just back to the privacy policy itself. I mean, originally it was just a pretty long document, and you either read it or you didn't. And so we've kind of made some leaps and bounds, and now we've got sort of interactive video. You can easily click on sections you're more interested in. So we've got an overview page, and it says, you know, are you more interested in what we collect, who we share it with, how we use it? You can quickly get there, but I think where you'll see technology taking this to the next level will be in the choices and controls area, because of GDPR, because of California, where you have to give the consumer more control over what you do with their data. You know, all the check boxes that say you can use my data for this, but not this. And if you're using it this way, then I'm going to check this box, but then not this box, right? So I think where we'll see a lot of, and I know we're focused on this, is on the choices and controls more than the privacy policy itself. Because at the end of the day, if I told you my privacy policy, this is what we do, then I should be able to manage that in a controls, in a choice area. So I think we've seen awesome advances in those areas.
Yeah, I would add to that there's the question of, do I trust you to do what's in your privacy policy, right? And can I observe what you're doing to build that trust, right? There are organizations that I trust with my data. There are also organizations I do not trust with my data, right? Because of the behaviors that I've seen them exhibit, or the lines of business I see them pursuing, and I don't want to be a part of that. But it's difficult without sort of a radical transparency to vet whether they are in fact doing what they want. And I think those choices and controls that you're talking about are a great way to do that, right? To expose to users what you're collecting, and to tell them in line with that data, here's what we do with this. And one example that I've seen from both Amazon and Google that do this well, they collect audio data from Amazon Echo and Google Home, right? You speak to those things, or you speak to Google Assistant, they collect audio data for that. And they put that up online in your account, and you can actually see it. So if you go into your Alexa app on your phone and go to history, you can see all the utterances that you made to your Amazon Echo, and you can go listen to your daughter say, play It's Raining Tacos, right? Or whatever your kids do with your Echo. And the fact that you can go in and you can audit that, right? I mean, you said audit's a dirty word, but like that's what I do. I go in and I look and I go, okay, is this collecting anything I don't want them to collect? No, it's not. So I think that builds a lot of trust for me personally with those two organizations, because I can do that.
I do find it interesting. You start turning off things by permission, and something else breaks. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden, these companies that are not conforming to those protocols, perhaps they're a startup or it happens to be, maybe their service is better because the user doesn't know, well, I'm actually giving them this data. I mean, does that create a scenario where there's sort of a vacuum for companies to step in because they're not necessarily having to comply? They're too small for people to care?
I mean, trust is trust. So, I mean, I was thinking when you were saying that, Joe, I was just thinking about, what that can do to a business if I turn this off, but then I don't turn this off. And so that's where we get a lot of pushback from our clients. And they say, well, wait a second. And so this scenario where we've now, again, digging deeper into the nuggets, we're now able to show them, hey, remember when they selected this off and it screwed you over because we had no way of knowing if they were truly using it for your stuff or somebody else's? Now I can differentiate that. Right, so it's actually, again, a privacy by design, and it's a big win for the business. But back to your point, and back to what you just said, I mean, you either trust a company or you don't. So the first time you told me I had control or I don't have any control, then that, to me, that's on the consumer to make those decisions with their wallets or feet or whatever it is.
Another question from, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and I think it's gotten much, much better. The levels of control, the ability to say, well, okay, you can have control of my microphone, but you can't have control of my photos, right? You can't. I mean, it's gotten much better over the last 5 years.
And you were mentioning a moment ago about Alexa and getting the history and all that information out of there. Apparently, from the crowd, there's been a number of attacks to that vector. How do you prevent against that? And what kind? Well, I'd be wondering if are you familiar with some of those attacks?
I'm not familiar with anybody actually succeeding in doing anything with that data, but certainly that data is at risk. I think you Derek, you mentioned somebody splicing audio back together to create a voicemail from the CEO directing wire transfer, and that's a possible scenario with audio data, right? There are even companies that are making technical advances in being able to synthesize audio that sounds like it's coming from you. So right now I'm giving you this is streaming somewhere, right? And somebody's capturing audio of me speaking, and they're going to build a model of my voice, and they're going to make me say anything they want, right? A little sock puppet version of me. And that technology actually exists. We've built a version of that in-house because it's a threat against voice systems, right? And so we're studying that. So I think there are those risks. There's a lot of precedent for how to protect that kind of data in contact centers, and especially in financial institution contact centers, where we deal with payment card data, we deal with bank account data and other sensitive information. And the payment card industry data security standard has some very specific guidelines around how you protect that data. But ultimately, it comes down to isolating access, controlling access, limiting access, as well as choosing not to store certain things. So PCI DSS says you cannot store a recording that has the CVV number on the back of your card, right? The one you have to put into websites. If that occurs in the audio, you can't store that, even if it's encrypted. Like, you have to throw that out. So I think maybe there's some precedent for how to deal with that.
I'm a big fan of easy risk mitigators. So I don't think we can eliminate many of these things, but if we can reduce it to a statistical unlikelihood. So before they were integrated, I bought the little stick-on cover my camera covers. And that was dorky for a while, but the concept that someone could commandeer a camera, which of course now has been validated, was clear to me. And I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna have a little cover and I'm gonna cover it. Did I not want to have a camera? Well, no. So Luddites may say, let's just not do some of this stuff. I'm not for that. I have home automation, but I'm choosy about what I'm doing. I don't have cameras in lots of places where I want to have an expectation of privacy, trusting that they're not on. I do have Alexa, and there's raining tacos in our kitchen all the time, but I don't have it on in a bedroom or on in my office. I have a puck sitting in my office, and it's on mute for 300 days of the year. I just decided I don't want that on for all the discussions I might have in my office, but we've decided in our kitchen for all the fun things that can be done with it and the useful things, we're going to do that, but we try to be mindful of not having any kind of, sensitive conversation were we to have one in the kitchen. So I think we're making choices about what's in our home and what is it doing and what are we doing with it, and not trusting, for the large part, not trusting that the providers of those are, answering all those needs.
So I had an interesting conversation last year with someone, and we were talking about hacking this kind of stuff. And you hit mute on Alexa, is it really muted, right? I mean, there's a whole industry, multi-billion-dollar industry on hacking. Go online, Google, search, you'll get the scripts. It's, the right is free speech. And in other countries, they'll take those scripts, they'll put in the variables they want, and they'll run them as bots against any computer that isn't patched a certain way. And it's the more technology that's out there, the more vectors they have to get back in. But it's a really interesting subject. I'm a little paranoid, I guess, because
Me too.
I've been doing this a long time, so I don't. I like the camera cover. I think that's cool.
Question from the crowd, kind of interesting one actually. Two-factor authentication. So there's been a number of exploits related to SMS two-factor authentication. Don't use that anymore. But someone was saying, why not? Is there some way to use other people as a two-factor, a friend or a family? Like, is there some way that you could triangulate that as a better two-factor authorization?
A proxy. You talked about a proxy earlier, right?
Crowdsourcing. Yeah, exactly. Is that who that is? Is that who that is?
9 out of your 10 friends say that is you. Something like
Facebook
that.
uses that as a way to get back into your account, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. From a technical perspective, I don't know.
I think it's an interesting notion. I'm not prepared to say, yeah, we should do that, but it's under the concept of innovations. What might we do differently than we've been doing? And there's clearly, that's where some of the answers are going to come from. Doing what we've been doing, whatever the old saying is, if you do the same things, expect a different result. It's, I don't know, forget what the punchline is, but you know what it is. It doesn't pan out. So I like, thinking about those sorts of things. I think we should be.
Yeah, I agree with that. The definition of insanity, I think, right? So thinking out of the box like that, whoever suggested that, that's a great suggestion. And that kind of thinking is what we need.
It was anonymous.
It was thank you, anonymous coward, right? But that kind of thinking is absolutely what we need, because the existing mechanisms are very clearly broken, right? We can't continue to rely on knowledge, things we hope are secret, right? When in fact we know that they're not. And so clever and unique solutions like that, even if that particular idea doesn't work, somebody will riff on that idea and maybe find a way to make that successful. So I applaud that.
I think I have a slightly different perspective on the issue that we talked about. So two-factor authentication is essentially what you see and what you know. That's the whole basis that we have. So although some of the mechanisms don't work, the solution works in general. So if you are to protect 1 million users by leveraging two-factor authentication, that certainly works. And maybe the attacks that happen are like so highly sophisticated and targeted to certain individuals that, you know, the compromise might happen in those cases. But in general, I feel that it is good enough protection for the general population. So that doesn't mean that we just have to discard that solution and come up with like brand new solutions.
Like three-factor authentication, right? Get 3 friends that are, but I love two-factor authentication because it's coming back through a separate channel. If I'm using my cell phone, I'm on SS7, my computer's on the internet, TCP/IP, voice, you know, so it's actually using a whole separate channel to come back and ask me, hey, you logging into Apple and here's your 6-digit code, right? I get a lot of emails lately that, hey, you just logged in on LinkedIn from a different computer. Is this really you? If it is you, great. If it's not you, please let us know immediately. So, yeah, I mean, it's a place to go to feel more secure.
Yeah, I think Mira makes a great point that we should not give up improvements, even small ones, in the quest for something perfect, right? We're probably not going to get to perfect security. Let's be frank. But I think that two-factor is certainly better than one, even if sometimes the implementation of the second factor is problematic, right? And the more factors you add, the harder it is to compromise all of them. So
and the time. I think you had asked earlier, Joe, about time or what's the cost of that time, right? So two-factor authentication takes time. It might be 5 seconds, 20 seconds. But there is a degree of time involved, or cost involved, yeah.
Yeah, I agree as well. I definitely wouldn't want my comment to be interpreted to not use good risk mitigating technologies, even if they're, you know, it seems like they're going to be exploits of everything that we adopt at some point in the future. So we do want to reduce the risk to acceptable level, and two-factor's clearly something that more people should be using. Doesn't eliminate it. So that was the comment of, we're never going to arrive. There's not a secure destination on this. There's just get to more acceptable. And if a lot of people would do that, make it harder for someone to exploit you, you can increase it from, you know, a low security maturity to even moderate with pretty easy to do things. It does get harder, and it's more time consuming and things that maybe consumers won't do to go from a moderate level of security to something really, really high, and that may not be, you know, desirable or warranted or even achievable for most people. But going from where most people are to where they could be, there's really low-hanging fruit. And I think there's little simple things too. I don't know how effective it is, but I'm like, hey, why not? It doesn't cost me anything. If you've wished me happy birthday on any social media platform, that is my internet birthday. It's not my real birthday.
I have that too.
It cost me nothing to do that. And occasionally I get some messages saying, I thought your birthday was on a different day. I'm like, well, that's my internet birthday. You're close enough.
Happy 25th, by the way. Cool. Do we have any more time?
No, I think we need to wrap it up.
Wrap it up.
Have some last minute comments, please.
Yeah, you guys.
I think from my perspective, consumers, us, users of endpoint devices, need to be aware of how vulnerable they can be. And to use things like two-factor authentication, really look at the choices you're given when you download an app, and ditch the apps you don't use.
Read your privacy policies. Hopefully they're not too onerous. But no, other than that, I would say for those of you who are, you know, in this space and designing products, designing software, et cetera, I mean, you're probably already thinking about these things. But again, it's a sweet spot if you can get in early, start thinking about privacy early. It doesn't take a bunch of crazy coding and technologically advanced concepts. It's things that you would want as a consumer. So just think about privacy early and often.
Cool. All right.
You know, I'll just share one little statistic that I think is interesting. We think about this, the scope of this problem and opportunity, mobile. I just read this recently, and I was thinking, I haven't looked it up, but our population, adults, is something in the 350 million people in the US. So in China, there's 800 million unique mobile users now, and 80% of e-commerce is being done through mobile. So that's just an interesting scoping kind of perspective. CCAP?
California Consumer Privacy Act.
I did want to mention real quick, so I saw a question that about this whole discussion, what is the cost? I looked up the value of Facebook stock, the number of users. You're worth between $200 and $300 each to Facebook. Doesn't count all the other platforms that may be out there.
Cool. All right. Well, thank y'all.
Okay. Before we finish and say thank you, what I'd like for all of you to do, if you wouldn't mind, please, is get on Slido.com, get into that event code, and we have 3 simple questions for you to please answer on, how we did. We're trying it for the first time. If you wouldn't mind, please doing that. And while you're doing that, I want to thank the panelists, and please give them a round of applause. And here is a gift from the Wireless Technology Forum for y'all. I could only carry that many in my hand. We've got a lot of requests today, so as soon as you're done, thank you again so much. Thank you. Thanks. Is that one of the things that I'd request is if you can look around you, see what you've got, in the way of plates and whatever you might have around. If you wouldn't mind just picking it up for us, it'll help us out, and throw it in the trash can on your way out. We'd really appreciate that. Again, we thank you all for coming. We'll see you next month. Again, remember, second Thursday is on the Women in Wireless at Peachtree Corners, and third Thursday back here again. Thanks again, and I also want, where is that thing that, oh, here, it's in my pocket. Thank all our sponsors. Please make sure that you use our sponsors. Thank you again, and have a great night. Thank you. Thanks again.